One guest left to go here for today's program. That is Wes Reynolds at Wes Reynolds and the number one on Twitter. Wes, how's it going today, buddy?
Hey, Adam. How are you today, man?
I'm doing well. How's everything going on your end? You keeping your head above water here with all the stuff that's going on out there in the betting market?
Trying to. This is always, it's kind of a double-edged sword. It's always, a great time of year because you have so much going on, obviously, with NFL, college football, World Series, NBA, hockey, and then obviously getting into college basketball here in a couple weeks. You have so much going on, so that's a good thing because there's plenty of stuff to follow and plenty of stuff to bet if you're a sports bettor, but also there's plenty of stuff to bet if you're a sports bettor. Where it can be a little bit overwhelming this time of year with so much going on.
And, of course, your volume makes my head spin to begin with. And college basketball here beginning November 10th. What do you do in November and December? Do you just live off of Red Bull, Taco Bell, and Monsters, or what?
You pretty much have to. A lot of caffeinated beverages and, depending on how we fare, some nights it'll be beer and alcohol. But, for the most part, it's Diet Pepsi and iced tea and all kind of, caffeinated beverages to kind of get you through the day.
All right, let's get into some NFL stuff here. I want to talk a lot of NBA with you in the tail end of today's segment, so we'll talk some NFL first. Beginning with this Thursday night football game here between the Miami Dolphins and the Baltimore Ravens. Baltimore -3 with varying juice out there in the market, but the prevailing number generally -115, a little bit lower at Pinnacle, 5 dimes -105 on both sides here. I thought it was really interesting that when numbers were coming out on Sunday here for Week 8, a lot of people I respect out there in the Twitter community grabbing Baltimore -3, whether it was -110, -115, -120. Now this number is just kind of situated right back where it opened. Are you surprised that we haven't seen too much movement here?
Yeah, I think this is probably in the range of where it's going to stay. And in disclosure, I did also play Baltimore. I don't see it, moving too much higher. I don't know if there's a ton of faith out there in the Baltimore Ravens having lost 2 in a row. It seemed like they kind of got right when they went to Oakland and had a big win, and then they lose in overtime to Chicago, game that they had to come back in with a couple of special teams touchdowns, and then lose in overtime, and then they go to Minnesota, and you think, well, okay, maybe they've kind of gotten right here. They've, that was a, kind of a fluky loss because it's not like Chicago really played great in that game. And then going to Minnesota, who's not a team with exactly a high octane offense, who wins, kind of running the ball and playing defense, which is almost an anomaly here in the NFL in this era at least, and with it being such a passing league. And then they drop that. So Baltimore, I think, is kind of endemic of what the National Football League is. There's not really a lot of great teams. In fact, I don't know if there are really any great teams. And there's only a couple bad teams, and then everybody else is kind of in the middle, where you're not sure what you're going to get week to week. And you look at Miami, how they've struggled offensively in so many games. They were shut out by the Saints in London, and the Saints not known for their defense, even though it's a little bit better this year. And I think that these are two teams that you look at are like, well, how is Miami 4-2? And, Baltimore being 3-4, I think that was kind of expected, that they might be around a 500 team. But these are two teams, I think, that have kind of been a little bit Jekyll and Hyde. And so that's why I don't think that you're really seeing a ton of faith in Baltimore here, but maybe not a ton of faith in Miami either, because, at 4-2, that looks to be a really good record, but in a way they seem a little bit like a paper tiger when you look at a couple other teams that have the 4-2 records, where it's like Seattle's 4-2, well, they're better than Miami. That's no surprise. And New Orleans is 4-2, well, they're better than Miami. So, you've got a couple, I don't know if this is the right word, but you got a couple weird teams here, and the fact that you're not really sure what you're going to get. I think, I felt Baltimore was the side because, not that Matt Moore is not a capable quarterback. He's been very good against the spread, and, he's been a very good backup in this league and kind of forced into the starter role from time to time. But, this seems like a game where Baltimore has been so erratic that maybe they're kind of ready for a really good performance here.
Now, something I wanted to pose here, and these are two horrendous offenses, both of them 4.3 yards per play so far this season. But you mentioned Matt Moore, and that was the direction that I wanted to go here with this next talking point is maybe it's just me, and I know that Jay Cutler's 4-2 as a starting quarterback and all this type of thing, but I almost feel like Matt Moore is a better fit for this team offensively right now than Jay Cutler is. Cutler just looks disinterested. He looks like he's not very good. And Matt Moore, I mean, he's probably got a chip on his shoulder with the fact that he was passed over, with the fact that they gave $10 million to Jay Cutler at the 11th hour to bring him in. But I don't know. I feel like Matt Moore is maybe a better fit right now for this offense, and I kind of have a little bit more of a glass. My glass is a little more half full than half empty this week on the Dolphins, I think.
Well, and I can certainly understand that because I think, the Cutler thing, I think, was the connection with Adam Gase and having worked with him in Denver. But I think, if you look at Matt Moore, I mean, he clearly would have a better idea personnel on the team since he had worked with them a little bit longer. And, I mean, so I can see why people think, well, maybe, Matt Moore is maybe the better fit here because I think he understands his personnel a little bit more, even though, maybe some of the plays and whatnot are different. But, Adam Gase was there last year, so Matt Moore worked with him. So it's not like that, Jay Cutler is the only guy that can fit offensively with Adam Gase. I understand why they brought him in, but, Matt Moore seems to be a fairly smart quarterback and, can kind of, fit in with that scheme and understands what they're trying to accomplish offensively and understands the playbook, understands the concepts and whatnot. So, I mean, the play of not maybe playing Miami this week isn't necessarily an anti-Matt Moore thing because I think that they'll perform probably about the same, potentially even better long term with Matt Moore. But it's more of a I guess kind of a play on Baltimore here than it is an anti-Miami play.
Well, and for Miami here, something that's really interesting is the spot because they played that game in London October 1st, had to come back, play right away against Tennessee in their home opener in Week 5 because they played at Los Angeles and at the Jets in the first two games that they played. Then they're at Atlanta. They play the Jets again, eke by in that game. Now the short week to Baltimore. And again, this is a team without a bye week because that game against Tampa Bay in Week 1 was postponed. And one of the things that does concern me a little bit about Miami here is that Adam Gase came out earlier in the week and said, hey, we're using this weekend like our bye week since we don't have one. So that could be a little bit of a look-ahead spot for the players with such a tumultuous schedule here so far.
Yeah, I think so as well. And also, I think one of the reasons that you haven't seen this Baltimore line, going back to the first point of discussion here on this game, why you haven't seen this really explode is because Baltimore, if you look at their injury list, it's pretty lengthy. And they've had to play a lot of different guys and really, I think, go deep into their roster. You have Jeremy Maclin questionable. They were very much banged up at receiver. They got 3 or 4 receivers questionable for this game at least. So, you're kind of banking on the fact that at least maybe a couple of these kids are going to play. And, they surely needed it. I think Baltimore had difficulty, sustaining drives last week against Minnesota, but Minnesota is a good defense all along with Miami. So, you're kind of taking a little bit of a leap of faith here with Baltimore, or at least I am, because of the amount of injuries they have. But I have to think that they're going to get a couple guys back here at least, which can do nothing but help based on their performance last week.
Well, I'll be really curious to see where this number goes on game day here, when limits reach their peak, when we have a better idea of who's going to play, when the public gets involved. I'll be interested to see, if Baltimore is the side here, if we do see a little bit of Miami money, thinking that Matt Moore, is kind of the elixir for this team. May not be the best game to play necessarily, but it is one to watch with some handicapping interest, because both of these teams, of course, having played in London, you've got some difficult scheduling spots coming up for them here as we keep moving forward. Speaking of London, let's go over to jolly old England here for game 251, 252 on the board. Minnesota takes on Cleveland. Minnesota's a 9.5-point favorite in London here for this one at Twickenham Stadium. This was not at Wembley. It's at Twickenham. They had some problems with the surface in that game last week there, so we'll see if there's a carryover this week. But let's go ahead and start with, I think, the biggest story about this game, and that's the fact that the Browns will be without Joe Thomas for the first time in his NFL career. And obviously he's a big loss because he's a Hall of Fame left tackle, and he's a guy that consistently rates very well in the metrics even as he gets older. But I think emotionally, for a Browns team that's won one of its last 26 games, I think it is, it's almost kind of one of those, this was the guy that was sort of our stabilizing point, and now he's gone. I feel like emotionally it's going to be harder to play without him than it is physically.
Yeah, I totally agree, Adam. And I mean, I had the Browns last week was one of my better plays, and I felt like I was holding on for dear life once he went out of the game, because I felt that you really saw the Browns offense. Not that it was storming up and down the field, but they were a little bit more stable with Joe Thomas, and I felt once he went out of the game, I mean, it was very hard for them to move, because, I mean, if you watch that game with them and the Titans last week, that was a totally winnable game for the Browns. They benched Deshaun Kaiser again, who they made the starter after Kevin Hogan's tough performance in Houston, and then they take him out of the game, this carousel of quarterbacks, and they seem to move the ball a little bit with Cody Kessler. But they had opportunities to win that game because their defense, I thought, was outstanding, and I still think with part of that is Tennessee. I don't think Marcus Mariota is really yet 100% because you're not seeing him do as much running where he can cover up some of the Titans' offensive weaknesses. But I think, all of these quarterback switches, too, not just the Joe Thomas injury, but all of these quarterback switches, I mean, the fact that you have played 3 quarterbacks already, that you're clearly not settled on a guy. You look at their injuries. You have Myles Garrett, their star rookie, questionable. You have Jabril Peppers questionable. You have Jason McCourty questionable. So you have 3 to 4 starters that may not play, and and obviously the guy that's been probably their best player in the franchise with Joe Thomas. So, it's a little bit tough, I guess, to back Cleveland, even though I've done it a couple times this year in this spot. But I don't know how much I want to back Minnesota either, because, we know that Teddy Bridgewater is practicing. Now, he's not slated to start here, and we also know that Bradford, they may get him back here in, a few weeks. It says he's out indefinitely, but they think that he's maybe a couple weeks away. And you have Keenum, who I think is kind of, has done the job, not fancy, not spectacular, but, been able to kind of manage the game and do the job, and has led him to a 5-2 record. But this is a tough spot, I think, to lay near double digits as well. So this might be a game, unless I get involved with the total, that I may stay out of.
Man, I'm looking at this game, and to me, the only thing I can look at here is Minnesota. And laying a massive number in London is a very, very hard thing to do. But you've got, and this kind of harkens back to the Super Contest discussions that we've had, both with you here on the show and also Sports Cheetah, you've got 6 teams on a bye this week. You're not playing the Thursday night game. All of a sudden, you got to play 5 out of 12 games. And if you don't play this one, you got to play 5 out of 11. So you have to play 45% of the games that are available to you, and that makes it really, really difficult to do. So I'm kind of taking a deeper look at this one because I just don't think the Browns match up really well here in this game. They're leaving for London tomorrow night. They're going to get into London early Friday morning. Hugh Jackson doesn't like to leave early. That's something I've found out from a couple of my friends that work for the organization. So, you run into a situation here with Cleveland where they're getting in late. They're not going to have a whole lot of time to get adjusted to the time change, the jet lag. The quarterback situation's a train wreck. Myles Garrett's in concussion protocol now, so he may not be going with them. And obviously, with so much invested in him as the first overall pick, a transatlantic flight with a concussion, probably not the best of ideas for them. So he probably won't be there. And then also the defensive scheme for the Browns, they stopped the run very well. Joe Schobert, Christian Kirksey, both very good in support against the run. But this Minnesota passing attack, there's not a whole lot of downfield stuff. Play 20 yards off the ball. They're going to be trying to come up in coverage. They're going to be trying to come up to stop the run. Maybe Pat Shurmur throws a few more wrinkles in there for Minnesota. I think this game could get really ugly. But again, you're talking about 9.5 in London, and you just don't know where Minnesota's at right now in terms of, how they're treating this trip. It's tough to do, man. It's really tricky.
Yeah, and a couple things to add on there. What you were saying about, Minnesota using the underneath. I'm no DFS or fantasy football expert, but Kyle Rudolph might be kind of an under-the-radar tight end play for your lineup because, they're probably going to go side to side, maybe go over the middle with a short passing game. So there's that. And also what you're saying about the Super Contest, the fact that there are also 2, and maybe you could even put 3 in there because a couple places they're -10 plus juice in the Chicago-New Orleans game. So you got about 3 other games. When you talk about the 5 of the 11, you've got 3 other games with double-digit favorites. Cincinnati over Indianapolis, Philadelphia over San Francisco. And I think a lot of bettors kind of sometimes, especially for contest purposes, get scared off of those double-digit games. So, kind of like last week, I felt last week was a tough board. Whereas the week before, I felt like the situations kind of jumped off the page a little bit. And I think this week is a little bit of an iffy board as well because you've got either really short favorites for the most part, or you've got big favorites. I mean, there are very few of those games kind of in the middle, in that maybe 4 to 5 or 6 point range. I think there's, maybe 2 on the board. So, yeah, I think this is also a hard week to get down to get to 5 in terms of, maybe you got 2 or 3 that you really like, and then you kind of gotta. And that's the thing about this contest. Sometimes you're not gonna see 5 plays that are gonna jump out at you, where you got to take a little bit of a leap of faith and take a risk and kind of almost, there's luck involved in this in these contests, and where you got to kind of maybe guess a little bit, where you say, okay, this is going to be my 5th play, I'm down to this, and then you just got to decide and hope you decide right.
Yeah, and this is something that we'll talk about later in the week with Sports Sheet. We might as well mention it now here while we're talking about the Super Contest. You mentioned last week being a tough board. The Super Contest consensus last week went 1, 13, and 1. The top 11 picks all lost. The top 12, 11, and 1. 33.87% was the final count for the traditional Super Contest. 4,344 winners, 8,482 losers, and then 809 ties. So it was a brutal week in the Super Contest, and obviously this week, doesn't set up that much better either. So that's why I'm taking a much harder look at a game where in a traditional week, if I'm seeing a number like this in a London game, there's no chance in hell I'm giving it a second thought. But this week, you kind of don't have a choice. And you kind of wonder for the Browns here, what their mindset is. I mean, they had a winnable game last week, like you said. They almost played an entire 5th period in that game. Now they go to London, where they're going to probably get blown out. How invested are they? Is this a business trip? Is it a vacation? How are they handling this spot? A lot of things to consider here for a game that, like I said, normally you'd probably just kind of write off. All right, how about a pretty big game here in the 4 o'clock? Or go ahead.
Well, what I was saying, too, and by all looks of it, it looks like Minnesota is probably going to be a heavy public play. But one of the things that you learn over time, and sometimes you have to learn your lesson from losses. The public's not always necessarily wrong. It's like if you go with a fade the public strategy, that's maybe a good long-term, over a year, over a 2-year sample size to go through, that you'd rather be on the side, it's just common sense, you'd rather be on the side more with the sports books than you would with the average public or casual bettors, because, if the sports books were losing long-term, they wouldn't be open. I mean, I haven't seen a sports book shut down really ever except for a renovation. They're not shutting down because they're getting their butts kicked by the bettors. But you got to look at the fact that sometimes the public can be right in these games. And, it's not like the public's wrong 70 or 80% of the time. I mean, they're at least going to be right in the mid-40% of the time. So, the strategy doesn't work of, always fading the public or always playing with the public. Yeah, I mean, you really got to do your work and pick and choose. So, don't be scared sometimes to have a public play, because sometimes these public plays get there.
Well, speaking of sportsbooks shutting down, we'll pour one out for the iconic Stardust there, which obviously got knocked down many, many years ago. But that was a sportsbook that had a significant impact here in how the industry is, in terms of the way that we know it today. All right, let's get to the 4 o'clock games here. There's only 2 of them, and one of them is an East Coast game with Dallas and Washington. So that'll kind of give you some kind of idea on what the schedule makers had to work with here this week, with a lot of games out east. But one game that is not out east, Houston and Seattle. Seattle 5.5 point favorite, and now bookmakers at 5, DSIs at 5, Pinnacles 5.5, along with most other books out there in the market. And this is another one of these games where you have such a high level of intrigue with this one, because Houston's a pretty popular team here late, played very well against New England, blew out Tennessee, played extremely well against the Chiefs, but couldn't come away with that one. Beat the Browns as well they should. But you've got this Houston team here coming off the bye, and we've seen over the last 3 weeks, teams coming off the bye have been very, very popular from a betting market standpoint. However, they're going to take on Seattle. And people look at Seattle, and they do this year after year, and say, okay, at some point Seattle's going to show what they are, who they are. We find them at 4-2 here, but honestly, their body of work doesn't really impress me.
No, it doesn't. And, I mean, I think you could kind of tell that a little bit in the line. I mean, in terms of, I'm not a big, hey, make a power rating on every single team. But when you look specifically at home field advantage, and the default really for home field advantage would be, -3. Some teams would be less, some teams would be more. Seattle probably rates the highest home field advantage in the league, at least does for me. And, I mean, Seattle, their home field advantage is not 3. Their home field advantage is probably like 5, 5.5 or something, and that's exactly what the line is. So I think it's almost like the odds makers are telling you, hey, these look like, based on what we've seen so far, that these are pretty 2 even teams. If they played at the equidistant or median point between Houston and Seattle, whatever that may be, on a neutral site, this would probably be kind of a pick-em game. And I do think Seattle, I think there was the buy low opportunity, even when they were a double-digit favorite over the Colts on that Sunday night game, when Seattle had kind of really started out iffy. And they started out iffy in the game and then eventually ran them out. And then they go in a grinder game and beat the Rams, and then now they went back east and beat the Giants. So I think you're kind of seeing Seattle being priced, I guess, maybe what they were expected to be at the start of the season. But the fact that there's still a pick'em here gives me, a virtual pick'em when you're accounting for home field advantage. In this spot is a little bit questionable for me, because you look at Houston. Houston has definitely found an offense. They have finally, I think, found their quarterback with Deshaun Watson, and they are putting up pretty good numbers offensively. But look at the injury list. I mean, it's not just losing arguably your 2 best defensive players to IR with J.J. Watt and Whitney Merciless. You've had Brian Cushing out for suspension, and he's not probably going to be back until December. You have a lot of question marks, I think, on their defense, too, with a couple of their linebackers that have been forced into action are questionable. Corey Moore still was in concussion protocol. So you have a lot of different things at play. Houston's a banged up team now. It looks like Dwayne Brown has ended his holdout and is going to be back for Houston. Now, how much in football shape he is after having held out this long is begs the question. But I think this is a very tricky game because you know that Houston has an offense, but you know they have their own problems with injuries on defense. But you look at Seattle, they have their own problems. I mean, their offensive line has, much like many other teams, and we've had this discussion before, the old Bill Collian quote that offensive line poor play in the league is now an epidemic. Seattle's fallen prey to that. In the fact that their offensive line hasn't been great, and I think that's one of the reasons their offense has kind of been at sometimes hit or miss this season. I mean, they really didn't get it going until the second half. They have injuries as well, even with the poor offensive line play with Luke Jokel out, and George Fant, of course, has been on IR, the former basketball player at Western Kentucky. So you've got two teams, I think, with some questions here of where, that's going to probably tell a story of where these teams are heading. Houston still, even with all the injuries on defense, still in the AFC South race. Seattle looks like they're kind of playing how that they were expect play, but yet nothing's really wowing you about them. So this is going to be an interesting game. I'm not really sure what to do with it, to be quite honest with you, because I think, I think it's telling you that the odds makers aren't sure what to make of it either, going back to what I was saying before about the home field advantage, that without that, this is pretty much a pick-em game.
Also starting center Justin Britt with a sprained ankle, and it is a variation of the dreaded high ankle sprain. So we'll see if he's able to go here for the Seahawks this week. And obviously the center critically important in terms of line calls and setting up blocks and all that type of thing. Houston's defensive line is down with the injuries that they have, but still there's some pretty decent pass rushers there on that team in the two deep. So again, I mean, this all cycles back to the super contest argument of, okay, if you can't play this game because, you have a lot of questions for both teams, extensive injury lists. Now, we have seen this number come down from 6 to 5.5 or 5, but it doesn't really take a significant amount of money or significant involvement to push down through 5.5 or 5 because those aren't really key numbers in the NFL. So, you're just running into a situation here on this card where there's just not a whole lot of anything that looks real attractive.
No, not really. And I mean, you're banking on situations. I mean, I've only made, and I don't make a ton of plays early in the week because I kind of wait for the lines to settle, wait to see till I get some more injury reports. I mean, I've only played two games on the card. I played Baltimore and I played the Lions for the Sunday night game, getting 3. But I mean, I really haven't played anything, and you haven't seen a lot of big market moves except for maybe 1 or 2 totals. You kind of saw this particular game with Houston and Seattle has made a pretty big move on the total from 43 to 46 at most places because I think people are now accounting for the fact that Houston's got a very dynamic offense that can score a lot of points. And, you saw what they did. They put 30 on Kansas City, in the 50s on the Titans. Some of that was a couple of defensive scores and some short fields, but they put up a lot of points here. And then the fact that, Seattle maybe that their offense, at least in terms of making plays downfield to their receivers, they were able to do that a little bit on the Giants in spite of their offensive line being banged up. So, you've seen already a big move on the total for that game. But if you look at the sides here, you haven't seen really a ton of line movement this early in the week, and I don't think you'll probably see a ton of it until maybe Saturday morning, right when the college football games kick off for the early slate.
All right, let's move over to the NBA here. We'll talk a little bit of association. Everybody in the NBA has now played 3 or 4 games, so not a significant sample size by any means, especially out of the 82 that are going to be played. But, Wes, is there anything you've picked up on here so far? Any betting tips, any observations, first half, second half, live betting type things that you've seen?
Well, I think you've looked at a couple of teams. I mean, that maybe weren't expected to do a whole lot, I guess, this year, that maybe the win totals were a little bit down, and they have, it's only 3 or 4 games, but you've seen, the Clippers, I think, got taken down a lot because of losing Chris Paul and Redick and those teams, but they've started out 3-0, and I talked about that when we were talking about the season win totals, and I played it over 44.5, and I thought, they were a team that were in the mid-50s. Even losing a player like Chris Paul, that's a pretty darn big drop. And the Clippers have started out 3-0 this year. Memphis, another team that started out 3-0, had a lot of changes, going with a little bit of a younger team. But I still think that they are maintaining that defensive identity. Sometimes you look at how the Warriors are playing, and a lot of teams, I think, are trying to play kind of how they play, but you've got a couple teams that are zigging when the other teams are zagging, either copying the Warriors or whatnot. Memphis is still very much a more defensive team, as is Utah, and the Clippers have seemingly been more of a defensive team this year. I mean, people forget they still got DeAndre Jordan, they still got Blake Griffin, they still got a pretty good solid front line, and even accounting for their scoring, maybe trying to be a little bit more of a defensive emphasis, realizing, hey, we can't compete firepower for firepower with the Warriors with all the scorers and all the shooters that they have. So maybe we've got to take a different kind of roll the cigar a different way and focus a little bit on defense. The scoring, I think, has been up a little bit early, and maybe that's to be expected. Eventually, I think perhaps that goes back to regresses to the mean over time. It's hard to say with only a couple weeks into the season, but those are some different things that I've noticed. I think in terms of you have some teams that have added superstars that obviously have expectations through the moon, and they've kind of been a little bit iffy. You look at Cleveland; they're 3-1, but they were very close and really could never get away from the Bulls last night. And then Saturday night they lose at home and really get stomped at home by Orlando, who doesn't have a lot of expectations early in the year. And you look at Oklahoma City; they're 1-2 to start out the season. They won their first game, the opener against the Knicks, and then have lost their last 2. So, you're seeing a little bit of maybe the price inflation on some of the teams that have added a lot, and then kind of a deflation on some teams that have lost a lot early in the season.
All right, so we've got a very, very big card here on Wednesday, and the board's starting to light up a little bit as I'm talking. I think there's 10 games here tonight. So let's talk about that for a second, because you've got a daily grind in the NBA. I mean, there are games every single day, including Christmas Day, with the exception of the All-Star break, of course, and I don't think there are games on Christmas Eve, if I remember correctly. So, you run into this situation where you get some of these really, really big cards. So walk us through your thought process here in terms of, when you're looking at, you've got 10 games in front of you or 11 games, whatever the case may be on some of these nights. Sometimes it's more than that. What's your starting point? How do you start to break this thing down and narrow your focus?
Probably the first thing I kind of try to look at is maybe some situations. If there's some kind of angle, if there's a short-term revenge, if there's a back-to-back, looking at the injury reports, or looking at kind of the schedule dynamic, if they've come off a big rivalry game, if it's like if the Cavs maybe just played the Celtics, which is obviously a rivalry, and they know that they're going to see each other down the road more than likely in the playoffs, then they play a team that maybe they should beat. And you kind of saw it a little bit with the game against Orlando on Saturday, where they were down at home from the get-go and never could get going, and Orlando pretty much ran away with the game. So you look at a little bit at those dynamics. you look and see maybe what the line moves are, and if in fact that these are kind of like true moves, if a total's moved 4 points, or it's like, okay, we're just getting out ahead of something, and then maybe we'll come back late on the other side, because sometimes even in football, you see a total move 4 or 5 points. The inclination for a lot of people maybe is to follow that instead of maybe coming back the other way, saying, okay, the number's gotten a little bit out of whack now. But it's still so early in the season, it's tough to really do that on totals, because I think the odds makers are probably just as unsure of their numbers as the bettors are. So that's one of the things, and that's one of the things I have to practice what I preach here and learn that, because there'll probably be a couple nights on the short NBA season so far where I've been a little bit guilty maybe of having too many plays, and I'm finding the nights I'm more successful is when I have maybe less pregame plays and more plays during the game, or more first halves or second half plays. I find that I'm doing better that way rather than going through the board and just playing the board kind of pregame here.
All right, let's look at some of these examples specifically here for tonight's action, and let's go ahead and start with the Cavs. I know we mentioned them a couple of times here. Game 507, 508 on the board. Cleveland's a 7-point favorite in Brooklyn. It's a back-to-back with travel for both teams. Cavaliers coming off of a late flurry to beat the Bulls yesterday. They never had any chance at covering that game in a 119-112 win. Brooklyn, on the other hand, taking a 9-point lead into the fourth quarter, wind up losing that game by 4. They did cover the number for pretty much everybody out there, except for the 5 dimes close, which was 3. But this is a situation you run into a lot in the NBA. You've got a back-to-back with travel. You've got a superstar in LeBron James who, look, LeBron James last year led the league in minutes played per game. That can't happen. LeBron James cannot be doing that in his, now that he's on the other side of 30. The Cavs just can't allow that to be a thing. But right now, they don't really have a choice because Derrick Rose is hurt, Calderon's hurt. They've got some guys they're trying to work in, and LeBron's really carrying this team 34, 13, and 2 last night. So they really don't have any other option. So in a situation like that, Wes, where you're looking at a game here tonight with the Cavs on travel, LeBron's going to have a heavy workload back-to-back games, big game for Brooklyn, and Brooklyn won't have many big games this year. How do you approach this one?
Yeah, you have to look at the fact, starting with Cleveland, they have been flat their last 2 games. They had that awful loss against Orlando and then never could really get away from the Bulls, who I think looked like that their expectations were accurate in terms of them being one of the worst teams in the league. One of the things that I saw last night with that Cleveland game is you had LeBron playing a lot of point guard last night, and I think that you're going to maybe see that until Derrick Rose gets back. He was running the point a lot, and obviously is able to get offense for himself, but was able to get offense for Kevin Love and for Kyle Korver. LeBron down the stretch. When he was playing the point guard last night, had 5 assists and 2 steals in the fourth quarter. So, it wasn't just him, I guess, necessarily going for his offense. And, with him running point, he's going to get fewer rebounds, but he's going to get a lot more assists and steals. And, just looking at what the Cavs are doing, you're kind of thinking, are they going to be flat again against an opponent that they should roll over? Or are they going to be, wanting to kind of get right and say, we played 2 bad games where the Cavs, we need to get right here. And on the Brooklyn side, Brooklyn, even without Jeremy Lin, which has been a little bit of a surprise to me, their totals have been 3-0-1 to the number this year, and they're scoring a ton of points. And they seemingly are letting these guys run a little bit more. They know that they're probably not going to be that great, even though they look in the interim to be better than they were last year. But even without Jeremy Lin, you saw them. They put up a ton of points last night in Orlando. They've been able to score the ball. Now, defensively, they're still, I think, kind of trying to figure things out. So, you would kind of at first glance, if you're a totals player looking on what you've seen so far, maybe look to the over here. But this is also one of those tricky situations with both teams off of back-to-back where maybe the Cavs, who have gotten off to two bad starts in their last two games, are really going to focus on getting off to a fresh start. And you obviously, this angle with Brooklyn having blown a fourth-quarter lead, is there a little bit of a hangover, even playing a, kind of a top and premium opponent, is there a little bit of hangover, at least early in the game? So the Cavs' first quarter -2 might not be such a bad bet here.
Now let's look at value in a number. In terms of the number here with 7, is that a key number? Is that a number that means something to you?
It is, because I think 7, obviously 6 points is still 2 possessions. And especially when you get to a game late. When, the NBA, for the most part, it's very rare you're going to see a foul fest in the NBA. The NBA, for the most part, if you're down 2 possessions and you don't score, and it's something like 20 seconds or whatever left in the game, 15 seconds, more often than not, you're going to see a team, let the other team dribble out the clock, and the coaches give the waves from the sidelines as they're leaving the floor. It isn't like a college thing where some of these teams will foul to the bitter end. If they're down 8 with 4 seconds, they're still going to foul. So 7 to me is always a key number, because it's kind of the first number that makes it a 3-possession game. Because even a 2-possession game, now a true 2-possession game is probably 4 or 5 points, but 6 points, that's 2 threes. So that, you could tie the game on 2 possessions theoretically. So that's why I kind of look at 7 as a true key number in the NBA going forward.
All right, let's go to game 501, 502 here on the board. That's the first one listed by rotation number. It's the Minnesota Timberwolves on the road against the Detroit Pistons. Timberwolves now a favorite at 5 dimes of a point. Rest of the market showing Detroit -1 here in this one. Minnesota coming off of a really, really disappointing first quarter and then second half last night against the Pacers. They were a double-digit favorite, and they got beat by 23. Now they're going to Detroit. New venue for the Pistons here, Little Caesars Arena, so maybe that's still a little bit different for them not playing at the Palace. But when you've got a team that got blown out as a double-digit favorite the night before, how do you treat them the next night?
Yeah, and that was actually an angle I kind of looked to play last night when I played the Pacers, because they were off a really huge win and a buzzer-beating win at Oklahoma City. And teams are going to get up usually for better teams. And, Minnesota, I think, had outplayed Oklahoma City for the most part of the game, and then Russell Westbrook kind of took over and got Oklahoma City the lead late. And, of course, they were able to have that Wiggins running 3 at the buzzer to win the game. So it was going to be a natural flat spot, but then Jimmy Butler was ruled out before the game, and he's still questionable tonight. And I think, Tibbs, I think, and that team is going to rely heavily on Jimmy Butler, not necessarily just for scoring. I mean, they were able to score points without him. I mean, I think offense is easier to replace than defense. And I think Minnesota kind of figured that out last night, because Jimmy Butler and Todd Gibson, I think, were largely brought in to help Minnesota on defense. And because you've got a couple young players there that are very skilled offensively, but are still trying to figure it out defensively, that being Karl Anthony Towns and Andrew Wiggins, who are really going to be the cornerstones of that franchise going forward. But they're still trying to figure it out defensively. So Tibbs brought Butler and Gibson to help them in to do that. And then when Butler was out last night, I think that you saw that their defense really struggled. And the Pacers' offense, that they're trying to be a little bit more up-tempo this year, so they're going to score more points offensively. But you could really tell, seeing that game, that Minnesota's defense struggled without Jimmy Butler. So you're accounting for that, and then you're accounting for the fact that the Pistons have been so erratic. I mean, sometimes they play a really high-scoring game, and then they had the game with Philadelphia, who was coming in winless at the time, and the Pistons just, they couldn't sustain scoring at all. So they're one of those teams early on that have been really erratic. And, this is a tough game to get involved with, I think, without knowing the status of Butler. You got to think that conventional wisdom, Minnesota would want to come out better after taking a real butt whooping last night at home. But, I do think that this is where an injury is not necessarily overcompensated, because I think to be better defensively, Minnesota's going to need Jimmy Butler. And even in one game, you saw that they missed him greatly last night.
Both games at Little Caesars Arena easily going under, 192 in the first game with a total of 202. And then that Philadelphia game that you just mentioned, 183 was the final score. 215.5 was the total for that one. Do you think that this is the start of a trend, or do we need to see a lot more here from the Pistons at home before we can make some determinations about the shooting backdrop and the shooting conditions?
I think it could be a good short-term trend that you can take advantage of, but I don't know how much it's going to hold up over 41 home games for this inaugural season in the new building. But maybe in the short term, I think you can really probably, still look to take advantage of it. I mean, we've seen some decent trends. Now, it didn't happen to go right on Monday night. I'll flip to a couple other teams here with Sacramento and Phoenix. Sacramento's pace has really been one of the slowest in the league, and they have gone under by a bunch. Now, in Phoenix, they both darn near scored 120 points on Monday night, but I think a lot of that was maybe Phoenix pushing the pace a little bit more, being excited with the coaching change and, kind of getting back to what they do, and the fact that their scoring had been down a couple games, that probably the line overcompensated for that, and I personally fell for it and took a second half under on it and thought, okay, the Sacramento's pace is going to show up here, and it didn't in the second half. So, you've got these short-term trends that you can look at, and see if you can wait for the odds makers and the bettors to catch up on a number. But eventually they do catch up on a number. So I don't necessarily see this as a 41-game trend at home for the Pistons going forward.
One more game I want to touch on here for Wednesday. I know we're going a little bit longer with our segments than usual, so I appreciate you hanging in there with me. Indiana and Oklahoma City. The Thunder now a 13.5-point favorite at several shops, a few still holding on to 14. We all know the big storyline here in this game. Paul George taking on his former team. But what I'm interested in hearing your thoughts on, Wes, is this Oklahoma City team. 1 to the good, 2 to the bad here. They beat the Knicks, who are obviously horrible. Lost at Utah, lost to Minnesota at the buzzer, like you mentioned. It seems like this thing just isn't quite together yet with Carmelo Anthony, Paul George, Russell Westbrook. I mean, Westbrook's enjoying having 2 scorers with him, 12 assists per game. But Carmelo's taken the most shots here so far. George, is only shooting 37%. Seems like it's taking some time for this thing to come together. Why is this number so high?
Yeah, I think a lot of it is because maybe there's the expectation because he's had kind of a slow start. I mean, the big 3 so far has really been the big 2 because Carmelo, seemingly, because he's getting a lot of shots, has seemingly acclimated a little bit faster than maybe Paul George has. And I think Paul George is really a little bit more of a two-way player than Carmelo. He's a better defender for sure than Carmelo. But he's kind of gotten off to a slow start. Russell Westbrook is doing what Russell Westbrook does. The numbers are pretty much the same, and he's, through 3 games, I mean, it's still MVP-type numbers. But, I think maybe the market is anticipating that Paul George is going to go off here, that he's kind of due for one here, maybe fired up to play his old team. And, left kind of, I don't want to say acrimoniously, that's not the word, but it wasn't a smooth exit for Paul George here because it was at the very final moments where he kind of, said, hey, I'm opting out of my contract. Because I think if he would have been a little bit more clear and a little bit more honest earlier in the process. Maybe the Pacers, because the Pacers got slammed for that trade. You're giving Paul George away for just Sabonis and Oladipo, that you didn't get more for him. Well, the Pacers were kind of stuck between a rock and a hard place because they knew, okay, we can't bring him back because if he's made his intention clear that he's leaving, how is that going to work with a locker room where you're bringing a guy back that's for sure going to leave? But we also have to trade him, but because everybody knows that we now have to trade him, we're not necessarily going to get the full value for him. So, I mean, that's what I think. But I think, this number at first does look a little bit high because I think you got a Pacers team that could have a little bit of a chip on their shoulder, especially the guys that returned. I mean, it's a pretty brand-new roster with so many new players, but you still got a couple holdovers for that team. Now, Miles Turner, not sure if he's going to play. He's still in concussion protocol, and he's missed the last 2 games. But, you got a club that might have a chip on its shoulder here in terms of, hey, this guy didn't think we were good enough, to stay with. So maybe we're going to come out and show something. So it's not I'm not in a rush to bet the Pacers because I do think that Oklahoma City, Paul George might be due for a really good performance here, but I'm not in a rush necessarily to lay that number because you got an underdog that I think is going to at least give you a max effort here, even off a back-to-back, that's going to play hard because of, their own personal motivation.
Well, Wes Reynolds, you can follow his work on Twitter at Wes Reynolds and the number 1. Excellent segment, man. Lots of eye-opening stuff and great insight here from you, and we'll talk to you again next week, bud.
All right, Adam. Always a pleasure being on with you, man.